Geez, I had the material. Okay, so just a summary. I had some
Hang on for the
material which
Hebrew
I
name.
copied.
Add the Hebrew name.
Uh, Shifra Simcha Bat Yeta, and whoever else needs a refuah, may they have a speedy refuah shalema.
Amen.
Okay, so just one thing. I had some material. I'll have to just get it again, but I've got something just to finish off um, what we discussed last week, which responses to certain things during davening, and got a summary here. So, well, for answering Amen, Amen can be answered when hearing a blessing, but not during your own personal prayer, like the Amidah. So, Amidah is basically you can't respond to anything. So that's Amen because because you're supposed to be concentrating on your own prayers, and that's why you can't answer to someone else's prayers. Only after you've finished your Amidah. Then Baruch Hu Baruch Hu Baruch Shemo. It's also you can't respond in the middle of personal prayers such as the Amidah. Kedusha, if you in the so in at a certain point in Kedusha, not in the middle of the Amidah, you can actually join Kedusha. But if you finish up to Bas Shalom, I think towards the end, you can before you do the Ose Shalom, there's a paragraph before. If you complete that, then you can join Kedusha. Join you can respond to the Kedusha. That's the only point in the Amidah because where you basically at the end, but not completely finished there, where you can actually respond to Kedusha. And then your Shmei Rabbah, which is in someone's Kaddish, also you can't interrupt your Amidah. And also, it doesn't, it probably also the Shema as well. In the middle of the Shema, you can't answer. In between paragraphs, I don't have that info. I need to actually just look at that, but I didn't get that info. So basically, in the middle of the Amidah, you can't respond to anything. Just that is that is a benchmark
Okay.
or a default.
Thanks, Kev. I'm going to
Shkach.
share one part of the Mishnah. Just want to bring it to your guys' attention. So if you have a look, it says Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov said, if it was after the stone left the thrower's hand that the victim thrust his head out into the stone's path and caught the blow, the thrower is exempt from exile. Okay, so that's the first part I want to bring up to you. The second part, which is the last paragraph, is Abba Shaul that used the example of a person chopping wood in the forest to teach us something else. Is that just as chopping wood is a voluntary act, so to any act causing death must be a voluntary act in order for the law of exile to apply. This excludes from exile the father who hits his son and inadvertently kills him, and the teacher who chastises his pupil and inadvertently kills him, and the agent of the court who inadvertently kills someone in the performance of his duty, all of these killed while performing a mitzvah. So those are the two that we're going to just put emphasis on at the moment. Now, with regards to this rule about a victim placing himself in the projectile's path after it was released, the thrower is not subject to exile. So how do we know this? Because we learn in a brisa, it uses this term, and it found. Okay. And this obviously, by comparison, excludes one who presents himself to be killed. Because if you look at where Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov derived that from, is it said it was only after the stone left his hand that the victim thrust his head out and received the blow, and therefore the thrower is exempt from exile. Now, how do we know this? Is because it used this term, if you remember, stating the whole point of exile. It says that the axe head or wood chip, depending if you go by Rava or the sages, found his fellow man and he died. So what does it mean, found his fellow man? Is that that person had to have existed in the equation before the accident happened. So it's when two people enter a public domain where both the perpetrator and the victim um, can reside or conduct activities. So, being a public space, one has to be extra careful, even if it's not negligent. The fact of it is, risk can happen. But if somebody ran into an area where you thought was clear, or they entered a private domain, in this particular case, it certainly is not the person's fault that happens to throw a stone in this particular situation. But how do we know that? It's basically the emphasis is on whether it's past or future tense. So how do we know this? Is that when the whole brisa brings this up, it says, where do we find this word matzah? So matzah is not just unleavened bread. It's a term meaning found. Okay. And he will find, depending if it's on the past tense and the future tense. So if we go to this particular pasuk, and let me just see where it is. It's in Vayikra Leviticus, chapter 25, verse 26, and it says, if a man will have no redeemer, but he will acquire means, and he will find enough for its redemption. So what it's actually talking about there is that a person is forced to sell his ancestral lands, and for the first 2 years he cannot buy it back. But if after that period he comes into money, then at that particular point he can buy it back for what he sold it at. Okay? The primary mitzvah is that if the seller has relatives, that they should redeem the field from the buyer because it's ancestral uh, property belonging to the whole family. But obviously, if he has no relatives, he has to have the means to be able to redeem the property himself. And in that case, after 2 years, the buyer must make it available for him to repurchase at the same price that he paid, but not before 2 years. That's what Rabbi Aran Cohen said to me. Now, one of the things is it uses this word, and he will find enough for its redemption. And what does this by comparison mean? Is that if the funds were already available at the time the lands were sold, it would have said that retroactively, when they did a search in terms of assets or title deeds, they found, past tense, that he had the funds available. Will find means he has to be able to prove that at that previous point there were no other assets at the time that he sold his ancestral land. Otherwise, he can't force the buyer later to redeem that property because we have to see it from both points of view, a way to protect the buyer and a way to make sure a family doesn't lose their ancestral homeland if poverty should strike them. So what's the Gemara saying? It uses this example in the Bryce and it says, look, what they don't want to happen is that he's got multiple properties, and what he wants to do is actually buy a field closer to him for convenience, and then in that particular case, he is selling a land further afield, it's also family land, and then redeeming the one closer with the proceeds, because this is not fair to the buyer, especially at this very low cost. And the only reason he's doing it is he wants two properties next to each other. But in order to protect the buyer, they're going to say to him, give us a full list of title deeds under your name. And if he doesn't declare it, there's obviously a sort of system then that they have no, where at the deeds office, they're able to determine according to somebody's ID or their companies, etc., all the lands that they actually have from an asset-based point of view, or alternatively, finances available for that redemption. So that's one particular aspect. And Rabbi Cohen even went as far as saying if the person has money overseas, like he's got a holiday home in the Maldives or something out of Eretz Israel, that's still considered an asset base. Um, the other thing that we want to prevent happening to the buyer is that the seller, well, the person sells his land, but what he does is he wants to sell an inferior piece of property in order to buy a superior piece of property and use this ancestral claim to get it at rock bottom prices because his family owned the whole area. So this is why it uses the statement and he will find future tense. Because if he had the means before and he found it, he can't use this exit strategy. Okay, so that's why it uses this factor of he has not found any new assets. Now, uh, the one thing that you've got to bear in mind is the entire point of this is that the Torah gives the right of redemption only for changed financial circumstances to aid the seller who's impoverished, but not for a change of heart where the person maybe sold it but now is feeling a little bit sentimental. It's not fair to the buyer or has decided to really have a situation of convenience where he's getting properties close to his current property or he's getting a higher quality of land. He cannot manipulate the situation. So that's very similar to why we have like a prosbul, where if you want to borrow money, in order that, but you want to borrow, it just happens to be before the Shemitah year when all debts are forgiven. It's not fair to do that. And the rabbis knew that a rich person wasn't going to lend a poor person if they took advantage. So the debt was sold to the court and that person waived their right, basically. Okay. So it's very similar here. So the Gemara responds according to Rava. Here, in the case of the wood chopping incident, we interpret according to the context of that verse. And there, in the concept of ancestral lands, we interpret according to the context of this verse. And what does it teach is that he will acquire the means because he said, and he will find some assets or some value. So it implies, what does it imply? From now on, he doesn't have the means now. From now on, he will find the means. At the point where he finds it, it's future tense. So too, if you take the same context in the verse, when you threw the stone, presently there was no one, and by the time the projectile left your hand, there was somebody. In future tense, the person popped in the equation. And on that basis, Rava said it works. Does everybody understand? And we can go on. It's very straightforward, nothing complicated. Any questions?
Yeah, all good. All good.
Okay. All right. So just hang on. There's just curtain closing time here. Um, all right. So
Sorry, Damon.
yeah,
Your question,
sure, Lance.
Damon, with the story with land being returned after, is it after 50 years, eh?
With the Jubilee year, are you talking
So,
about the Jubilee year?
yeah. So does the land, it doesn't just go back automatically, they've got to pay for it or what?
You know what? It
If the
does
person
cover it.
if that person can't afford to buy his land back, is it just tough on the previous buyer or what?
So what I'm actually going to do, it discusses it in 6 different receptors. One of them is Gemara Rosh Hashanah, because it discusses different types of New Years, both astrological, for the trees, for the harvest, and for people, and how different cyclic periods work, and also in Gemara Shabbos. And what I actually want to do, Lance, because it's something that has interested in me, and it's something that's going to come up in the upcoming sugya, is I actually want to find out all the implications of the Jubilee year as well as the sabbatical year, and if that 50th year has a different level of emphasis, as just not just 49 years plus one. So it's actually a share I want to try and see if I can get hold of that can just give a bottom line and either share it with you guys or give it over because it is an interesting topic. Yeah, also one thing I just want to mention to Lance is there is this concept that although you buy land in any country, you don't buy the mineral rights. And in Israel today, they don't sell you the land as such because otherwise many Arab citizens would just be buying the land. There are very specific constraints of what you're buying. You're buying the property, not the land and the property necessarily in the same way. Kev, what were you going to say?
Yeah, so this it's discussing now redemption of property in the Yovel year. Why is it discussing this? Why is this at this point being discussed?
Okay,
And
so
how does
it's
it relate to
okay, so it's not going to discuss it now. At the moment, it is a subject that's going to come up. The only reason what came up was this redemption of a field because somebody couldn't afford to keep their ancestral
mm,
land. This is
so,
in 8a2 and 8a3. The minute we get to 8b1, it's going to be discussing this issue of what's considered a voluntary act and not a voluntary act with regards to the sabbatical year, as well as with
oh,
regards to Shabbat and harvesting and reaping and the Pesach offering. So it's an issue that we are going to go through. So very well done for reading ahead. But that context is a different context. It discusses voluntary acts and a mitzvah-based act. So it's carrying on with this theme of Rav Abba Bar Shaul. What we're dealing with now is a different issue. This is the issue we're dealing with Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov. But what we're going to be dealing with in 2 pages' time is Abba Shaul's issue about a voluntary act versus a mitzvah-bound activity and what rules constrain it. So well done, Kev. But we're going to get to there. Gav, it's nice to see your face, man. Did your iPhone die?
I was busy making some food, so I thought it's probably inappropriate to look at some vegetables.
The only thing is we would have been chalishing. Just before we go on to the next thing, is Aiden, did he get there safe?
Thank God, yeah, all good, loving it. In the Tanya now, he's no, he's in China. It's, just waiting 2 minutes ago.
Yeah, and you know what? It gets dark late then now. So Netanya's beautiful. That's where Ronnie Lurie lives, Gav. Yeah.
Yeah, no, great.
So it's just, you know what? It's like all the South Africans, they don't live in Netanya. They live like 5 k's away from the beach. It's the difference between living in Sandton and Alex.
Yeah,
But they say they
it's
live
wild, eh? It's
by
wild.
the beach. It's wild. Um, so if he's there and he needs any contacts or whatever, just let me know. Because I know people all over the place. I'm sure you do too.
All
Just
right,
all right.
okay, cool.
So oh jeez, I got the snake. Lala, I fed you 5 times today. Go work for some of those calories, special girl. All right, let's get busy. Go. No, you've
Well,
eaten.
at least your snake with fur has never missed a shoe. Is more loyal than everybody else. Just
Yeah,
saying.
but she's never missed a meal either. Bless her. Um,
Because-
um,
and hopefully you're not going to be its meal one day. Huh.
All right, so this next section of the Mishnah deals with the following, okay? It says, all right, as far as Abba Shaul is concerned, there seems to be this case as if you're performing a mitzvah, you exempt from exile. But anything to do with a voluntary act where both the perpetrator and the victim can voluntarily go in a public space like a forest, it makes the perpetrator liable, but not so for an obligatory one. So there was a certain rabbi that asked Rava, look, if you take a look at this whole thing that killed the victim, it was a wood chopping incident that went horribly wrong. Either the axe head came off the handle on the 10th whack. Let's go even where the sages would be happier, not off the first whack. Even the sages would deem that grossly negligent if it's loose. But let's say after the 15th, 20 whack. Either the axe head comes off the handle and therefore the damage from the wood was a voluntary act, or alternatively, the wood chip killed the victim. But what happens if you were chopping wood for the very activity of performing a mitzvah? It uses 2 examples. Maybe you needed wood for a sukkah, and therefore, on the basis of needing wood for that mitzvah, you should be exempt from exile, or you might have needed wood for the mizbeach, for the altar, for the pyre, at which you have to bring the wood and you cook your steak and however it works with the kohen, etc. So both of those are preparatory acts to a mitzvah. So, according to this opinion of Rava, no, Lala, please go outside. Please, Lala. According to this particular example, why should you get off the hook for chastising your pupil or chastising your son or being an agent of the court and somebody dying under the guise of fulfilling a mitzvah? What mitzvah are you meant to be fulfilling? Or educating your child or educating your student or enforcing the law with lashes, either to Gavin Simpson, this is what you missed. It's not just with the case of Makkos for lashes, because there it's less likely to happen because they judge the person's health condition, their age, etc., and they generally border very conservatively of getting him less lashes than would kill him. So it's more likely to happen when they're trying to subpoena you for the court. The sheriff of the court can use force to subpoena you to a court case. So then the person might be a little bit more enthusiastic in their duties. So it says that that person gets off because they're doing a mitzvah. And same with a teacher or a parent. So why is that a case where that person is exempted? But according to this question posed to Rava, the merciful one said that if you're chopping wood in the forest, the killer should be exiled, even in a case where you're chopping wood for a sukkah or for a mizbeach. And Rava answered to him, listen, you've got to define here what is considered a mitzvah, because there's no obligation to chop the wood. The obligation is to do the mitzvah of building the sukkah and bringing wood to the mizbeach. In other words, it's conceivable to fulfill the requirement without performing the act. Its performance, even when necessary, is only a means to an end. It's actually not the mitzvah in its own right. Meaning, you have three choices. You can decide to buy pre-cut wood. On the event that there's no pre-cut wood or your wood gets ruined, you can alternatively chop it, but the mitzvah isn't to chop the wood. The mitzvah is to build your sukkah with that wood or take it to be burnt. So therefore, any preparation to a mitzvah is not the mitzvah itself which exonerates you. It's preparatory. And it is feasible to fulfill it by getting a hold of a third party that is already to chop the wood. And they're saying, then what about if they're at risk? Well, let it be their risk. It's not your risk. What do you have to turn your life upside down and go to exile for? Pay for it to be done and just have it done. And there were enough poor people that it didn't even cost a poor person to have a much poorer person chop their wood. So Ravina wasn't happy with this, and he challenged Rava from our particular Mishnah, and he says, look, if you've got a father who hits a son and the teacher who chastises a pupil, I love it, because he turns around and says, very similar to what Kevin Mayerthor said, when we use this term chastise, he's not a big fan of this, nor the agent of the court. So, in other words, he said, what happens if you're dealing with a good boy here? What happens? Let's just take out the aspect of the agent of the court. Okay? Let's just take the chinuch aspect alone. This is what Ravina says to Rava. What happens if it's a particularly good boy? And all you have to do is say, I'm very disappointed in you, son. Or the teacher says, you're not living up to your potential. Look who you could be. And that would be enough to motivate the kid. What do you mean that's a mitzvah? The mitzvah is purely to educate. And Rava says, okay, so you do have you might have children that are respond better to words than others, but the reason why it's a mitzvah is you've got to look at the long-term objective here. Is that he said, firstly, this chastisement isn't for the immediate benefit of getting the task done, but it's according to the Ritva, it's a long-term process of chinuch. And therefore, according to Shmos Rabbah on Proverbs, it says chapter 13, verse 24, he who withholds his stick basically spoils his son, but he who loves him hastens to chastise him. And there are numerous other verses that Avraham didn't chastise Ishmael, and then for Ishmael became a bit of a hooligan. So it seemed to be a very, very different time period. So according to Rava to Ravina, is you might have seen that the kid would have listened either way. But when it uses this term from Proverbs, chastise your son and he will bring you rest and he will bring delights to your soul, quite clearly their view of chinuch was in Tehillim chapter 29 verse 17, a very specific edict that the occasional beating made for a much more attentive and diligent pupil. Guys, I'm just reading it to you. I don't quite get it, but Gavin Simpson, what I mentioned to the guys is we were speaking one Friday night at Edwin's table, and Edwin said the kids' eyes widened like flying saucers when we were talking about back in the day at Northview with the caning, etc., and you were looking at it with fond memories and they were looking terrified. So, in a few years, Aidan and all of that generation, they don't know from it. So, I mean, how can you think thousands of years ago when in fact Oliver Twist, the oak stole a loaf of bread, they'd hang you for it, for minor theft. The people committed duels with swords and pistols and all sorts of things for honor. And now they've got self-help books. Try and restrain your anger because you can't tell your wife that when she reversed out of the driveway and she put a scratch on your door to where she says it's merely a scratch and wax will take it out. You can't open the car door, and you've got to suppress that anger into your shoes and say, honey, just be a little bit careful next time. The whole world's changed. So on that basis, we can't judge it. But Ravina is not a big fan of this at all. And in fact, Rava answers he answers another response to Ravina's challenge. And he says, listen, Ravina, I'll tell you something even further. What I'd said before is nothing. In other words, he's saying rather, if we even use this example, because you might say it's not the mitzvah. What's the mitzvah, guys? The mitzvah is chinuch, is to educate your child. So therefore, to give him the occasional pats, Ravina can still say it's preparatory. In other words, it's not part of the chinuch. It's a motivational tool, but it's not the actual mitzvah. So Rava says to Ravina, I'll tell you something even further. I'm going to tell you that if you want to interpret this as saying that if you chop wood for a sukkah or for an altar, does he even have the option of entering? Meaning, you could turn around and say that itself might cause exemption according to certain cases. And we have this. We have this in halacha. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says that Rava never abandoned his previous position and still feels in preparation to a mitzvah when somebody else could have chopped the wood. Rava's saying that you're liable. It's not the actual mitzvah. You could have had it done another way. But he's answering Ravina, in fact, saying that, listen, if you want to use that as an example, that preparation to a mitzvah is not the actual mitzvah, and you see this as preparation to chinuch, then I'm happy for you to derive the fact that for preparation to do a mitzvah, the person's also off the hook from exile. But that's your opinion. My opinion is it's not preparation for an education. It's a great educational tool that's going to create the quality of education. Now, others don't maintain it. If you look at the Meiri, he said that Rava indeed abandons his earlier position with regards to building a sukkah or getting wood ready for an altar, that in fact, if you do chop it as a preparatory act, it can exempt you from that particular activity. But he doesn't abandon the premise of Rabba Bar Shaul in terms of the fact that he criticizes the Mishnah. In fact, he agrees with the Mishnah. He just says in this case, according to the Meiri, you can even apply to the preparatory wood needed as part of a sukkah, if that's the only way you can get a sukkah done. Now, before we go into this whole extra piece now, Lance has a question. Lance, yeah? I can't hear you on mute. Lance, sorry, Betty.
Yeah, look, I disagree because you can't compare. You know what? If you're cutting the wood yourself, or you're cutting the sack yourself, you're doing it to beautify the mitzvah. You would be involved with the mitzvah and you're beautifying the mitzvah, doing it yourself, and you're going to extra effort yourself to make it more worthwhile to you. You can't compare that to smacking a kid, that's not beautifying the mitzvah. You know, you aren't making anything beautiful by smacking a kid. You know, I don't know how they can compare the two.
Okay, so
I don't know why.
I thought about what you said, and Lawrence, like we're coming from a different time. I agree with you. I think that I can't even get into that mindset. I'm actually in agreement with you. The whole point of the Gemara is to get in the mindset of how people judge things um, at the time. But all they were saying at the time is that it's not necessary. This is where Rava's coming from, not Ravina. Ravina is totally in agreement with you, Lance. Totally. He said, I don't see, he might have even agreed with Rava and say, listen, chopping wood could be like preparatory to a mitzvah, but it's not a mitzvah. Neither it's a mitzvah to hit your kids or hit your student, and therefore the mitzvah is education. So that's what Ravina says. He says exactly the way you did. And he said, if you could say that, you could say the same thing that, listen, technically you can do a mitzvah by buying wood. Technically you can educate a kid without beating them. So he would agree with you, Lance Ravina. Rava is saying, look, at the end of the day, with good kids, it might not be necessary. But I still agree with Abbas Shaul because you're looking at a long-term goal here. And you can't see 10 years down the line or 12 years down the line with education how it's going to be. In other words, what might happen is that a kid might be good in primary school, but the minute their hormones kick in high school and they start to challenge authority because the testosterone level is high or their hormones kick in and they want to be with girls or whatever, and they're not focusing on their education, a frusk then might be necessary as part of the educational tool, and therefore there's a long-term goal that's necessary for quality chinuch. That's all they're saying. That's all they're saying.
But also, Dame, I see a little bit differently as well. Like, I don't necessarily think we need to take this literally, right? I mean, I think it's all about time and about circumstances. I mean, it could be that, back then or even today in certain places and locations, that the way to educate and the way to actually have chinuch is to smack a child. Some places over here, maybe in David Linksfield, you have to take his phone away. I think the message really is here: how do you actually impart the information inside this particular person's head? Is it a smack? Is it taking his phone away? Is it grounding him? That's always been my issue. I think that's the biggest flaw about why that the Gemara has been written down. It should be an oral law. That's the whole point, because it changes with the situation and circumstances.
Hang on, but Gavin, one caveat here in this case. I agree with you. In many cases, there's different levels. We're talking about a case of an inadvertent killing. We actually talk about somebody that died. So this isn't
Okay.
a lateral principle of deprivation and other forms to create chinuch. We're saying, is this person responsible for the death when it's within their duties? And that's why the issue of policing doesn't come in, because to maintain law and order, because within your military duty or your police official duty, sometimes you have to apprehend criminals that are fully grown adults and would fight back. And each court case would judge if there's excessive force used or if you didn't know if the perpetrator was armed, etc. So here we talk about a case of, are they liable to exile because what they did was a killing, and it's absolutely wrong, despite the fact that it was under the pretense of a good motivation of education. Or do we say that it was a mitzvah and therefore they get off the hook? And if they get off the hook, I agree with you and Lance, it's a shocking issue. And Ravina feels it's shocking. Rava would judge it on a case-by-case basis. In other words, if it's excessive force or a head trauma, no question that person, and we're going to deal with this in the next Gemara, There are cases where where a father would be liable, but certainly a case where there was head trauma, that wouldn't be necessary. We might be talking about a case where somebody gets caned and they developed a blood clot or aneurysm as a result of the caning, but in 99.9% of cases, it would just result in a bruise. We're not talking about a head trauma wound, but this is literal because it's an inadvertent killing.
Yeah.
But I do
I
agree
was
with
just thinking, maybe,
yeah, I do agree with you
yeah,
about
no, just
deprivation
go
techniques
ahead.
of cell phone withdrawal or benefit or privilege withdrawal. I agree with you, as Lon said.
No, I'm just thinking, no, maybe the system's quite clever because, let's take a case of Chinuch, where say the rabbi, whoever it is, has a mitzvah, if you call it, to hit the child. Now, if he hits the child, good old Hami's father is not going to be too impressed, right? He's going to kill the rabbi. There's no question. So maybe like to balance that out is that Hami's not going to hit the child too hard because he knows that if he does and he kills it, Hami's father's going to start. He's going to start harassing him, maybe kill him. Like the system is actually quite clever. Now I think about it now.
Yeah,
You have
exactly.
everything balances itself out.
Exactly. The only problem with that is for me, if they deem it almost accidental or is off, where the Goel Adam can't touch him, you might be setting Hami the father up for actual murder when he takes rightful vengeance as to this abuse. So I'd actually be
Yeah, but he
very,
has an opportunity. He's
yeah,
still got an opportunity to kill the rabbi on his way to the Aram Miklat.
yeah, well, Hami better be getting on the treadmill just to speed up. But I actually agree with you, Gavin. There's always a yin and yang balance with this thing, where it actually might protect them from vengeance, and they might wish for exile, or they might get off the hook and deserve to be killed by the Goel Adam. Exactly. I think it's a balance. I think you're 100% right. The whole system balances itself out. I agree with you. And it also says that the same with Adim Zomimim is that why would the Adim Zomimim come at that exact time? Because it's orchestrated from Shemaim what would happen to a person. The timing could be any time. It doesn't have to be between the sentencing and the verdict being carried out. Why particularly at that time did they rock up? Could have been at any time. So there is a lot of divine guidance about how this thing plays out. But I think this conversation was probably one of the first had at that era because people would think nothing of killing a minor. Remember, minors didn't have the right to vote, neither did women have the right to vote. And we were in a certain way ahead of its time to say that you can't do this to a minor, especially if we hold by Ravina. Who says we have to hold by Rava? We might be one of the first to hold by Ravina, Lance. And therefore, we did something unprecedented and therefore give rights to minors. Does that make sense? And Abba Shaul might have had certain constraints at which a chinuch, a smack for a chinuch had to be maybe with a cane on the thigh, but certainly not a head wound and a slap. This is exactly how halachas develop. But the rest of the world didn't develop it at this time. Minors could have died working in factories or being beaten by teachers or parents. So we at least brought it to the fore as issues.